Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today, we continue our tribute to the independent, woman-owned distribution company, Zeitgeist Films. We'll be screening Nowhere in Africa, which won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film in 2001. It's a coming-of-age story about a Jewish family that flees the Nazis and finds itself as tenant farmers in Kenya. It's a great film, it's multilingual, and there's much to talk about here. Joining us after today's screening will be Professor Mikhail Dekel of the City College and a noted expert on Jewish literature and culture. Now, take a trip to Kenya in 1938. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. I hope you've enjoyed what I think is an extraordinary journey and a journey very, very different from many of the films that have been made about the refugees from the Holocaust. It's rich in so many ways, and we have 30 minutes to talk about it. It's an absolute delight to have here with me today one of my colleagues from the City College, Professor Mikhail Dekel. She's a distinguished professor at the City College and the Graduate Center of City University of New York. She's also the director of the Rifkind Center for the Humanities at the City College. If that were not enough, there's a very special reason she's here today. She's the author of the award-winning book, Tehran Children, A Holocaust Refugee Odyssey, which tracks the story of her own father as he escaped from the Holocaust, but in ways quite relevant, I think, to the film that we've seen today. And so why don't we just start with that? Tell the audience just for a minute or so about your own book and then how you see the linkage between these two works.
First of all, thank you, Jerry, for inviting me. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Same here, kid.
Yeah, on camera and off. Yes, so Tehran Children is a book about Holocaust refugees, Polish-born Holocaust refugees. So here we have a German-born family. I tracked down Polish Jewish refugees, but Germans as well, eventually, among whom was my father. So it's the book is a part memoir, part travel narrative, part history book about Holocaust refugees, basically in Central Asia, who went from Poland, who escaped from Poland into the USSR, and I can talk a little bit about that more later. But their journey was from the basically Soviet interior, in gulags in the Soviet interior, where they were deported, to then a second exile in Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan. From there, a small group, including my father, is evacuated to Iran, to Tehran. This is why the book is called Tehran Children. And from there, in the case of my father and about 1,000 other children, they're evacuated from Tehran to Karachi, which is then India,
right.
And then to Palestine. But other children, and this is relevant for the film, are actually evacuated to Africa.
Okay.
I don't talk about them so much, but I know about them, and to Kenya, to South Africa, other places. So it tells the story, which is very, very relevant, and some things are completely parallel, of the Holocaust that happened outside Nazi-occupied Europe. And this is the story we don't usually hear, right?
Exactly.
So we usually hear, when we talk about the Holocaust, we either have stories of people in hiding or people in, of course, the death camps and the concentration camps. We don't hear so much the story of the refugees, and when we do hear about the refugees, they're refugees in not in the places where, not in Africa, not in the Middle East, where in fact, in the case of Polish Jewish refugees, it was most of the refugees. So actually and people don't know this, and I didn't know this before I started my research, most Polish Jewish survivors survived in Central Asia, Iran, India, and so on. So they didn't survive anywhere, not in the United States, not in in other countries.
Yeah, so this is really just, this changes the map of that refugee odyssey. I mean, both your work, but just to point out to our audience that that the film they've just seen is based upon an autobiographical novel by Stephanie Zweig, and it is her story. She was a child. There is a coming of age story. She was repatriated like the girl in the film, had a very distinguished career in journalism, and then began writing fiction based in this. And then the novel itself was a bestseller. And so, following that tradition of, path from bestseller to movie, the film does follow that path, but it's an unusual path because it's really opening doors onto the experience of the refugees that we haven't known about before.
That's right, and it also intellectually opens other new questions. For example, questions of, or rather frameworks of looking at the Holocaust within the history of empire, right?
Bingo.
Within the history of colonialism and post-colonialism and the relationship between Europe and the colonies and so on. So it's very important to tell these stories. I mean, one of the reasons in my case why the story hasn't been told a lot is because, but this question of who is considered a survivor, right?
Okay.
I mean, are these people survivors, or they just had it easy, right? Because
Right, yeah,
they
they lucked out.
They lucked out.
Yeah.
And I mean, in fact, my book recently came out in Hebrew in Israel, and the title in the Hebrew is Bnei Mazal, the lucky ones, and it's an ironic title.
Right.
But it also isn't, right? So I always say, yes, you're only lucky to have gone through this if the alternative is a extermination.
Right.
But it's a very, very difficult and complex route.
Well, and let me just point out that is literally enacted in the film, because one of the things that sets up is the film sets up initially is the degree to which Jettel understands what's going on what terms does she understand it, and on what terms does her husband Walter. And so there's the debate internally here of she thinks something is terrible, and he's saying all of this is a matter of your frame of reference and your understanding of these larger issues that apparently you don't yet understand.
That's right. I mean, it was very interesting because as I said, I tracked my father, who was Polish Jewish, but after my book came out, I actually discovered many more stories. And then I actually, because people wrote me, and then I discovered actually that there was a pretty significant German Jewish community in Tehran.
Okay.
Who actually, just like these, basically really very similar story, where they escape, people leave with the rise of Hitler
Right.
in 34, 35, so before the war begins. And I have their diaries and so on. It's very similar also in terms of how they see the world and how they see Iran, for example. And
Right.
so, for example, in one diary, which is more like him, right? When the woman says, "I understood Hitler came to power. I understood at once that we have no country anymore, but we are citizens of the world, and we can go anywhere." They're also very much, and I think a little bit like this couple, they're positioning themselves in my story as universal subjects.
Right.
Less so as Jews than universal subjects. And they're coming in there and they're sort of interpreting what they're seeing
Right.
in Iran. And it's very similar in a way, because they also write about their cooks and their staff, but in a very complicated way, because they're there as sort of Germans, but they're, yeah.
Well, this is a very important point that you're bringing up, that again, kind of the master popular narrative always puts this, first of all, in binaries, and usually it's a kind of political ethical binary. Okay, so we got the good bad guys over here, and we've got the good freedom fighting people over here. Whereas the particular film we've just seen, first of all, it rejects binaries. We'll come back to that. But also, it's very interested in the way in which this experience has put people into these situations of cultural confrontation and linguistic confrontation. That you're wait a second, you're not only out of your house, but you're out of your language, you're out of your culture. basic things that you might understand, like what is the proper way for an older person to die, you know, in the film is put into question. And when the African women come back and they respond to her with their authority, and they say, what are you talking about? She is now she's being surrounded by the ancestors. She's happy, which for Jettel at that moment is this shocking confrontation of, it's a completely different way of understanding something than I, as a modern, very much secular, you know, German Jewish woman can conceive of this.
Yes, that's such a beautiful scene. That's absolutely right. You know, so I was just asked to write something for the Journal of Postcolonial Studies about the postcolonial interview, and I'm writing, and I'm thinking, yes, a film like this, or a book like mine, or the history really. That's not. It's not just a representation. It's really the history offers encounters that cannot be computed within colonial, postcolonial theory and any kind of binary oppositions, because you have on the one hand, yes, these sort of wealthy German Jews who are finding themselves in this situation, but they're also refugees and so suddenly the people in Africa are actually better off than they are, right?
Yeah, yes, yes.
And so they're stateless, they have nothing, so it lends itself, this state of extreme vulnerability lends itself for actually very interesting encounters, and those encounters shift over time, and I think that's also what is beautiful about this film, because it doesn't stay in one place.
That's
right?
correct.
It's not like, oh great, they were saved, and look at all these nice people who saved them.
No premature closure.
No premature closure. But that is exactly what happens. Things shift constantly, and so they have an encounter, what was also interesting is, yes, to see all three of them, including the girl, and in the history that I track too, children do a lot better in these situations. And this is the same in these little villages in Kazakhstan that they were living. Children, first of all, pick up the language very fast.
Absolutely.
Children are invited in very quickly, where adults are a lot more rigid in their habits and so on. And that's highly interesting. And when you read memoirs of children, that I've read from my story, sometimes they're really almost like adventure stories, right?
Yes.
So that's there too, right? So suddenly, and you have to understand, some of these bourgeois Jewish kids, including my father, he didn't even leave his hometown in Poland ever.
Right.
And suddenly he's finding himself, like 13,000 kilometers away from home alone, right? In his case, children alone and so on, in this strange place, as you said, linguistic, but it's not all. It's just highly interesting to look at the memoirs and what people wrote and so on about these encounters.
Right, and so let's just go back to that, and for example, and to Regina, she just remains open. She comes in a certain sense without prejudice, and so then all of a sudden she's able to soak up both the language but also the culture, so she can begin explaining things to her mother. She said, "Oh, well, there's something very interesting happening over the village," and she doesn't. When she describes the fact that they are speaking to the spirit of the mountain, she doesn't do it in any kind of hierarchical way. She's completely accepting of, well, we did things one way and they do it, and isn't this interesting? Because I've never met a ceremony to a mountain, before, and of course, each of these characters here has, what we who analyze these kinds of things, they all have a character arc over it. And as you were just saying much earlier, each one of these characters is not the same person by the end of this film, and not in the way of, how shall I put it, achieving goals that is in the kind of, adventure narrative. Okay, here's the problem. We've got to escape in this way. They've they've escaped. I mean, in the sense that they're not going to die, there. And then all of a sudden, there's all these things that happen that are paradoxical, like the women showing up and the fabulous party given for the enemy alien women who are being, which, and coming back to your point, about seeing some of this in terms of the war and empire and struggle over colonial, control. The officer says to the black maitre d', "You're overdoing it," and the maitre d' is the person who's maintaining the standards. And speaking back because he actually feels the privilege to speak back to someone. And you're saying, well, wait a minute. In a certain sense, you're saying, wait a minute, none of this makes sense. But that's what they have to cope with.
Yes.
Is none of it all of it being surprising and not making sense.
I think it's really, the film is very historically accurate, and that's one of the reasons I liked it, including the fact that and this is across in all of these places, including in Iran, the German Jews who are in one moment they're Jewish refugees, the next moment they're actually Germans, right? Who need
yes.
to be interned. And this is what, in fact, in Iran, it's even, there's at some point, all the people with German citizenship, including the German Jews, are rounded up in order to be sent back to Germany.
Yeah.
Right, by the Allies. So, and they are, last moment they're saved and so on. So, this question also of Jewish identity, right, and who, in relationship to all of these, to empire, to Europe. So, these are victims, but they're whites, but they're, so we have these different character arcs, and then we have this historical arc which changes over time. Right?
Absolutely. And again, Kenya, one of the reviews I had read on this was talking about, the film wasn't enough about the anti-colonial struggle, and I was saying, well, wait a minute, this is in the middle of the war. And actually, the film does have a number of those threads. And just to mention two of them, there's that appalling moment in which the other farmer, he just says bloody refugees. Right. And that, of course, is the cry of someone who feels, I finally got to a place in which maybe I can make something of myself, one of the promises of all settler colonialism, and now I've got competition. And they're interfering with me in this. And no sympathy for why they would be there, but this is now your competition. You're nothing more than that. Or when Walter gets the instruction from the counterpoint to the cook, the other overseer at the second farm, and when he tells him about loss, and when you have your land stolen from you. And again, it's a moment in the film in which, because Walter has been dealing so much with what he views as the survival issues for his family, that he, a person even of the kind of ethical consciousness we see him to have, has not considered this aspect of it.
Right.
He's not considered this aspect of it. But of course, we from 75 years on in history can say, well, good that this was introduced to you, because we know this is as soon as this war is over, this is going to become a global problem.
Right. Yeah, and he hasn't considered also, first of all, he's surviving, but also, he's coming from where he's coming from.
Exactly.
With his own limitations, with its own stereotypes, even for the most ethical person. He's thrust into this situation. Of course, yeah, he's just trying to survive. So yes, it's we can see it more clearly, and we can see also the little changes that happen.
Yes.
So first you're saved, but then all these other things happen, and then then you're like interned, and then you're sent, and so. And then, of course, she's sent back to the boarding school, and so each one of these. What's good about, to me, I'm very interested in, ego memoir, or this idea. She tells a very big story through the story of this one family.
Yes, absolutely.
And each one of the things that happen to these people really represents something much bigger than just this family, including, again, this historical trajectory. So, So yeah, by all means, this opens up. The world is dynamic, right? So
Right.
and one of the things that I think what's nice really about this film, and what I try to do in my book as well, is to show that it's not only the refugee who moves, but the host communities change.
Yes,
So
yes.
everything changes. Everything is dynamic, and then we see it as you said, after the war, all these communities will change. And some of these people, these Jewish refugees, will stay in these countries and then become, let's say in South Africa, become involved in the anti-apartheid movement,
Absolutely.
or then the people who end up in Palestine, like my father, then already they get involved in their own, their own struggles, and so it's history doesn't stop the minute these people are saved.
Right. Well, another scene that speaks to that is when she is called to the office of the headmaster.
Right.
And we've already had the setup for that, the way in which, the moment in which would all the Jewish pupils please step to the side, done with so much British condescension, it drips. The condescension there, and then he's coming in and he makes just the casual anti-Semitic remark of do you Jews always talk about money? Why do you have to always talk about money? The girl is being cast as a vulgar Jew in his view, but what we actually see there is by the end of this, it's not that his anti-Semitism is being permanently erased. I mean, later on in the film, they even say, can you imagine being invited by him? And everybody says no, at that. But at the same time, his needle has been moved somewhat in it. And then he gives her the book of Dickens, and then even he can imagine her as a Dickens character. And so he's, kind of like, oh, well, now I can imagine her in this way. And he's how shall I put it? He's broken out of the Jewish stereotype and gathered her into a classic British character in
Right.
some way. Okay. And so the film is full of those kinds of subtleties of people not being converted, not getting resolution, but being changed by these circumstances.
Right, and maybe even changed for. I mean, nothing is final, right? So maybe
Right,
even
okay.
changed for a while. Maybe he's changed in relationship to her, but not to the Jews at large, right? And we see that, again, in these refugee stories, we see that all the time. And we also see, I mean, it's actually amazing to see, I track down, let's say, the main story that I tell is of 3 children. My father, his sister, and a cousin. Each one of them went through this experience differently.
Okay, yes.
And one of the little cousin, who was I guess like 7,
Right.
was adorable and extremely polite. She used to curtsy in front of every adult. So every anti-Semite that she met along the way somehow ended up taking care of her because of
was
who
the
she
partner.
was. So it's also these situations where they're so dynamic that things can happen. I don't think the film or the novel try to say, yes, people are just converted by encounters, but it shows like these knots
Right.
where, yes, the needle does move.
Well, and again, another one of the examples of that, from the film, would be, the farewell with the cook, in which he's advising her that he understands that her character arc and her maturation has been on a very different scale and velocity than that of even her. Of her father. So there's the conversation that said, he's still a child. You're the wise one. Please help him. And we're sort of saying, well, this is upending a lot of things because we have a lot of timelines here. This is very gentle and lovely man, but who nonetheless stays within his own culture. We have the conversation about, well, wait a minute, you're polygamous. You have how many wives, how many children? How does your economy work? This is not like our economy, but he's given that ability, very rare, right, in a film, to give a film produced from the European side to give this kind of, not magic wisdom, but practical observational wisdom to that character that helps us judge these individual trajectories that you're talking about.
That's right, and also to affirm her
Right.
in some way. And so we have these moments. It's not just the story of the refugees kind of surviving on their own, and everybody else in their is in the background.
Right.
But he's a character too. Affirms him, she affirms, and he affirms her. And that's very important. I mean, it's ultimately a very humanistic film.
Well, yes, absolutely. And you know, a film that ends with a gift to Jettel from Africa. You know, the banana, and the way in which she can now be in the language she initially rejected when she says, if you're going to talk to me in German. And now she's being, you know, playful and ironic that I'm as poor as a monkey.
Right.
And she is by one standard, but she also understands the dynamics that are going on in a way she couldn't possibly. And then all of a sudden the banana, you know, is something it never was when she had it in, you know, in Germany.
Right. Yeah, and you really, and I think that's, you know, that's not at all kitsch. That's really, I think that really is the experience of people. I mean, they are thrust into this world that
Right.
they completely don't know, and they discover a different side of themselves. And at the same time, it's not just this kind of happy ending. You know, so because it's
No, as the woman walks away into the bush with dignity, you know, this is a film that is made in retrospect, and so we know, you know, what the tumult of that country will be, and to her traditional life in the years to come. So you're absolutely right. There is no easy closure there.
yeah. And at the same time, what's also interesting, since we know what will happen, that this is a very interesting moment. It's actually a moment that's very, I mean, maybe cosmopolitan is not the right word, but multifaceted, right? I mean,
Right,
and you
correct.
see that in all these countries with all these refugees, and again, in my example, but I think it's also true for Kenya. There are refugees in Tehran circa 1942. There are refugees from Germany, from Austria, from Poland, from Iraq. And different things happen. They're creating different things. They're bringing in different things. It's the same thing in Central Asia. When I was there in 2015 in Uzbekistan, people telling me, oh, you know, the refugees, they brought ice cream. They brought like different flavors that we didn't have before, and so on. So
We're going to, you know, we have run out of time, but I can't imagine, I couldn't have imagined when we began our conversation that we were going to end with bringing new flavors of ice cream. If you'd like to know more about City Cinematheque, or more generally about CUNY TV, there's a way to do so. Visit our website. That's www.tv.cuny.edu. Visit www.tv.cuny.edu. Always a pleasure to chat with you. Lovely to have you on camera this time, my friend.
likewise.
Okay, great. And I want to thank you for joining us today on City Cinematheque. And I hope you'll join us when we have future episodes as we continue our stroll through the archives of film history. But for now, it's goodbye.